Why did the colonel laugh? That question sat like a stone in her chest as the icy wind howled through the high mountain base. Master Sergeant Anna Sharma didn't flinch when he did it. She just stood there, boots planted in the frostbitten ground, hands at her sides. No woman had ever done this, that was what he'd said, before letting out a short, sharp bark of a laugh that cut through the silence. It wasn't a joke, not really. It was dismissal, plain and public. And it worked. The formation had gone tense, the younger soldiers exchanging glances. The sound of that laugh stayed with her as she walked back to the barracks, as she unshouldered her duffel bag, as she laid out her gear piece by piece. The Kalin Ridge High-Altitude Warfare Center was not a welcoming place. It wasn't meant to be. The base was a scar of steel and concrete clinging to the bones of the mountain at 12,000 feet. There were no warm lights here, no cozy corners, just wind, rock, and the sound of boots on gravel. Even the air seemed to resent your presence, every breath thin, reluctant to fill your lungs. Anna moved through it like a shadow, quiet and steady, her duffel heavy on her shoulder. She had felt this before, the moment of arrival when everyone was watching and measuring. Some wanted her to prove herself. Most wanted her to fail. She could feel it in the glances of the 20-year-olds lounging near the barracks steps, their laughter a little too loud, their confidence too casual. She ignored them. Inside, the barracks smelled of boot polish, sweat, and cold metal. A single row of bunks lined the narrow room, every bed neatly made. She found her name taped to the last bunk. The soldiers barely tried to hide their stares. She was an anomaly, older than most of them, her file a mystery, her presence something they hadn't asked for. She sat on the thin mattress and began to unpack. Her movements were slow, methodical. Thermal layers folded into perfect squares, webbing coiled and stacked, each buckle checked. It wasn't about neatness. It was ritual, control. A corporal across the aisle, Carter, his tag Reed, stopped mid-conversation with another soldier and just watched. He noticed the way she polished each strap until it gleamed, the quiet precision of her hands. It was like watching a bomb tech defuse something volatile, too careful, too practiced to be random. If anyone had been paying close enough attention, they might have seen it too. This wasn't an administrator trying to look squared away. This was someone who had done this for years. Someone who didn't waste motion because she'd learned that wasted motion costs lives. Later in the mess hall, she sat alone. She didn't slouch, didn't fidget, didn't seem uncomfortable. She ate with the calm patience of someone who had long ago learned that solitude was easier than conversation. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in every detail, who laughed too loud, who looked nervous, who carried themselves like predators, who like prey. She was building a map. And at the center of that map was Colonel Marcus Thorne. The next morning, his voice rang out across the parade ground, sharp and hard-edged. The formation of soldiers stood stiff in the brittle cold, their breath ghosting into the air. The colonel cut a figure that matched the mountains around them, tall, severe, with a face carved into a permanent scowl. He paced in front of them, tablet in hand, calling names, checking files. When he reached her, he stopped. "Master Sergeant Sharma," he said, holding her transfer file like it was an afterthought. "Your records are sparse." He tilted the tablet as if more information might appear. "Transfer from Logistics and Records Division in Stuttgart, paper pusher." The word landed like a stone dropped in water, sending ripples through the formation. A few soldiers snickered. Anna didn't blink. She kept her gaze fixed on a peak rising in the distance, as if he wasn't even there. The colonel continued, his boots crunching against the frozen ground as he spoke of discipline, the cruelty of the mountain, the tradition of Kalin Ridge. And then he mentioned the race, the Serpent's Ascent. 50 kilometers over ice and rock, full pack, no excuses. A trial by fire, or rather by snow and wind. His mouth curled into what might have been a smile. "We've never had a woman even complete the Serpent's Ascent, let alone place in it." He let the words hang in the cold air. Then came the laugh, short, sharp, dismissive. Frankly, no woman has ever done this. It wasn't meant as a challenge. It was meant as a ceiling. She stood at attention as the words sliced the air around her. Inside, something shifted, not anger, not humiliation, but something colder, sharper. She had felt it before in places where you either held your ground or you died. When the formation broke, the whispers followed her like a shadow. In the days that followed, Anna became a ghost on the base. She didn't join the packs of men doing sprints until they vomited, didn't compete for attention or dominance. She moved alone. She spent long hours in the cartography room, tracing the jagged lines of the serpent's ascent until she knew them like the lines of her own hand. Every gradient memorized, every rockfall marked. She walked the perimeter of the base in the freezing dawn, her breath measured, her pace steady, teaching her lungs to work with less oxygen. In the workshop, she made quiet modifications to her gear, a layer of insulation in her boots, a repaired clasp on her pack. She wasn't preparing for a race. She was preparing for a mission. Around her, the anticipation built like a storm cloud. Soldiers boasted about their speed, about how quickly they would break the course record. They showed off new carbon fiber trekking poles, ultralight packs. Anna just kept moving, silent and methodical, as though she could wait out the noise until only the work remained. The night before the race, the storm warnings went up. High winds, dropping temperatures, snow by midday. In the barracks, the bravado was gone. Men who had strutted now sat in silence, their faces pale. Someone muttered about frostbite from last year's run. Another mentioned a man who'd fallen and never returned to duty. Corporal Carter sat on his bunk, stripping his rifle apart for the third time in an hour, not because it needed cleaning, but because his hands wouldn't stop shaking otherwise. When he glanced at Anna, she was sitting calmly, laying out her gear on a towel, checking seams, testing buckles, each movement slow and exact. "You're calm, Sergeant," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him, her eyes dark and steady. "Panic uses oxygen," she said simply. It was not advice, not comfort, just a fact. And somehow it was enough. Outside, the wind screamed across the ridgeline. Inside, Anna Sharma finished her checks, rolled her gear, and lay down. The others tossed and turned, unable to find rest. She closed her eyes and waited for the mountain. The world was gray and silent. Then a single red flare split the sky, hissing as it arced upward before exploding in a bloom of color against the dawn. The serpent's ascent had begun. For a moment, the only sound was the wind. Then came the thunder of boots. Dozens of soldiers surged forward as if the starting line had been holding them captive. Snow and gravel kicked up under their feet. It was chaos, elbows and shoulders knocking, men fighting for position like wolves scrambling over one another to be first at the kill. Anna wasn't among them. She crossed the starting line in the last third of the group, her pace steady, unhurried. Her pack sat high and tight on her shoulders, her poles angled just right. The others sprinted as if the finish line was just over the next ridge. She moved like someone who had been here before, who knew how long the mountain really was. In the control tower, a warm glass room overlooking the starting field, Colonel Thorne sipped his coffee. His eyes tracked the blinking GPS dots on the large display, each representing one of the racers. "Number 73, he said dryly, gesturing to a lone dot already lagging behind the pack. "Sharma, told you she'd be on the first evac truck before Alpha." His aide, Lieutenant Mendoza, nodded, though not with full conviction. There was something about the slow, measured movement of that dot that didn't look like failure. It looked deliberate. Anna heard the racer's breath around her, harsh and ragged in the thin air. They passed her with quick glances, some pitying, some smug, before charging ahead. She didn't look at them. Her world had narrowed to a simple rhythm. 4 steps inhale, 4 steps exhale. Her watch beeped softly, showing her heart rate steady at 145 beats per minute, the sweet spot where exhaustion stayed just out of reach and endurance began. She let her body find that zone, locked into it, and stayed there. She wasn't racing them, she was racing the mountain. And the mountain demanded respect, not speed. The first stretch was deceptively simple, a rolling path along the lower ridge. The frontrunners took it as an invitation to push harder, opening up the distance between themselves and the pack. But the true test came soon enough. The trail turned, then tilted skyward, a brutal incline that climbed 2,000 feet in less than 3 miles. The snow here was packed hard, crusted with ice, and every step had to be placed with care. The sprinters hit it hard. Within minutes, their early speed betrayed them. Their breathing grew ragged, their powerful strides broke down into shuffling steps. Some fell to one knee, hands braced on the ground as they tried to pull enough oxygen into their lungs. Anna reached the base of the climb and did not change her pace. Her slow jog became a deliberate driving walk. Her poles bit into the ice, her boots finding each foothold with surgical precision. Her breathing stayed steady. She began to pass the first men, one doubled over, gasping, another retching into the snow. None of them looked at her as she passed. She didn't look back. In the control tower, Thorne's smugness had faded into something more watchful. "Zoom in," he ordered. The display shifted, focusing on the cluster of dots where the incline began. Number 73 was moving through them like a slow tide, passing one after another. "She's packing it," Mendoza murmured, a note of something like respect creeping into his tone. Thorne said nothing. By the time Anna crested the incline, the pack had thinned out. The leaders were still ahead, their dots moving erratically as they pushed themselves too hard, too fast. But Anna was no longer at the back. She was in the middle of the race now, quiet, steady, inevitable. The weather began to turn. At first it was just wind, strong enough to make the prayer flags outside the base snap like rifle fire. Then came the snow, light at first, then heavier, driven nearly horizontal by the gale. Visibility dropped. The world closed in. Anna pulled her hood tight and kept moving. She did not speed up. She did not slow down. Checkpoint Alpha came into view as a faint glow through the whiteout, a cluster of tents barely holding against the storm. Soldiers stumbled inside, some collapsing against the heater, some dropping out of the race entirely. Anna walked into the tent, her breath steaming in the freezing air. She refilled her canteen, tore open a nutrient gel, and swallowed it down in 2 bites. 94 seconds later, she was back on the trail. In the control tower, Mendoza frowned at the screen. "Sir, look at 73. She didn't stop." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Noted." The climb to Bravo was worse. The wind came in punishing gusts now, threatening to knock racers off their feet. The snow was deep enough to swallow boots to the ankle, and the temperature was dropping by the minute. More GPS dots blinked red on the display, signaling evacuation. 20 had already dropped out. By the time Anna reached the halfway point, she was in 8th place. Inside the Bravo checkpoint tent, the 3 leaders sat slumped near the heater, faces gray with exhaustion, ice crusted on their beards. Their hands shook as they tried to tear open ration packs. Anna didn't stop. She kept moving, her pace unchanged, her breathing as steady as it had been at the starting line. In the control tower, Thorne's jaw tightened. "Give me her biometrics," he said. Mendoza tapped a few commands, and a new screen lit up. Heart rate 146 BPM, steady. Core temperature 98.4 degrees F, stable. "Compare that to the current leader," Thorne ordered. The screen split. The Ranger captain's vitals were erratic, heart rate spiking to 180, temperature dipping dangerously low. Thorne stared at the 2 data streams. The calm, unwavering line of the woman he had dismissed told him something he didn't want to admit. This wasn't luck. This was mastery. "Get a camera drone on her," Thorne said finally, his voice sharp. "Now, I want eyes on number 73. The drone launched into the storm, its feed cutting through the snow until the image resolved on the screen. Anna Sharma, head down, poles driving into the ice, legs churning with the same merciless rhythm as before. There was no drama in her movements, only inevitability. Somewhere deep in the storm, the mountain watched. And Anna kept climbing. What happens when the mountain stops testing you and starts hunting you? The storm was no longer a backdrop. It had become a living thing, a predator made of wind and snow, waiting to swallow anyone who faltered. The path ahead narrowed until it was no wider than the length of a boot. The trail cut into the sheer face of the ridge. They called this section the Blade's Edge because it didn't forgive mistakes. Anna reached the sign warning of the traverse. The wind was deafening now, howling through the rock, trying to tear her from her footing. She didn't pause. She crouched, clipped her carabiner into the safety line, a steel cable bolted into the rock, and stepped out onto the ledge. The world dropped away on both sides. To her left, a vertical fall of several hundred feet into a glacier hidden under blowing snow. To her right, the cliff face rose like a wall. The only way forward was one careful step after another, her crampons biting into the ice. The wind hit her sideways, hard enough to make her lean her whole body against it to stay upright. She moved slowly, methodically, planting each step like a deliberate act of faith. Halfway across, she saw it, a shape crumpled against the rock ahead, barely visible through the curtain of snow. It was one of the leaders. When she drew closer, she recognized him, Lieutenant Hayes, a young officer from the 10th Mountain Division. His leg was pinned in a narrow crack, twisted at an angle that made her stomach tighten. Worse, his safety carabiner had snapped, leaving him completely unsecured. His face was a mask of panic. When he saw her, his eyes went wide. "Help," his voice was raw, nearly drowned out by the wind. She didn't speak right away. She crouched, her gloved fingers already pulling the secondary safety line from her pack, a piece of equipment most racers had considered unnecessary weight. She anchored it to the rock behind her with a double figure-8 bend, tying the knot with the speed and confidence of someone who had done this in worse places than this. "Don't move," she said finally, her voice calm, steady, cutting through the gale like a blade. He nodded, but his hands were shaking so badly, he nearly lost his grip. Anna moved with the deliberate precision of someone who understood the price of mistakes. She clipped him into the line, then examined the trap that held his leg. The rock was wedged tight, the angle brutal. His boot was pinned deep in the crevice, blood already seeping into the snow where the edge had cut into his calf. "You're going to shift your weight left," she said evenly. "On my count, 1, 2, 3. He gritted his teeth and did as she said, groaning as the movement sent pain shooting up his leg. Anna slid her ice axe into the crack, not as a weapon but as a lever. She applied controlled, precise pressure. The rock shifted just enough for the boot to come free. Hayes nearly collapsed, but Anna held him upright, clipped his harness to the cable, and activated his emergency beacon. "Stay put," she ordered. "They'll pick you up." Only then did she continue forward, her pace unchanged. In the control tower, the room had gone silent. The drone feed showed everything. Anna kneeling in the storm, tying knots, freeing the lieutenant, sacrificing precious minutes while the rest of the racers widened the gap. Colonel Thorne stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of stone. "She just gave up her place," one of the techs said quietly. "No," Mendoza murmured, his eyes fixed on the screen. "She just won it." Thorne didn't reply. He couldn't stop watching. Anna cleared the traverse and kept moving, her breathing still measured, her heart rate steady. The two remaining leaders were just ahead now, faint figures in the storm. She could see the way they stumbled, their forms breaking down, exhaustion eating away at them. But she didn't speed up. She just kept coming. Each step was a quiet refusal to stop. Each breath was a defiance of the wind. By the time she reached the next rise, she had closed half the distance. Inside the tower, the storm outside battered against the windows, but no one looked away from the screen. A communications tech spoke up suddenly. "Colonel, there's a Sergeant Rostova here, just arrived for the system's upgrade. She's requesting." "Send her in," Thorne said without looking away from the drone feed. The door opened and a tall, snow-dusted woman stepped in, stomping her boots. Her eyes fell immediately on the screen on Anna, a dark figure driving forward through the storm. She froze. "Is that," she whispered almost to herself. "Master Sergeant Sharma," Thorne said curtly. "Administrative transfer from Stuttgart. What of it?" Rostova let out a short, incredulous laugh. "With respect, sir, that's no paper pusher. That's Wraith." The room went still. Every head turned toward her. Rostova stepped closer to the screen, her voice low but urgent. "I was her SIGINT support for 3 years, sir, on 3 continents. You don't forget someone like that. She was the lead field operator for Task Force Chimera. Half the things she's done are illegal to even put in writing. If she's here under a cover designation, it means someone way above us wanted her off the grid." The name hung in the air like a bomb. Wraith. The control room was silent, but for the hum of electronics and the moan of the wind outside. Thorne stared at the figure on the screen, the woman he had dismissed, laughed at, written off as a misfiled name in his roster. Now she was moving through the storm with the relentless inevitability of a force of nature. For the first time, his certainty cracked. This wasn't just a soldier trying to prove herself. This was someone who had been tempered in fire and come out sharper. Outside, the storm screamed against the mountain. Inside, the colonel kept watching. What drives a person to keep going when everyone else is breaking? The mountain was howling now, a roar that seemed to rise from its frozen bones. The storm had swallowed the horizon, leaving only white and gray. The trail disappeared beneath fresh snow faster than footsteps could mark it. Each racer was alone in a world reduced to the length of their own outstretched arm. Anna moved like she had been born in this storm. Her hood was rimmed with ice, her lashes crusted white. Her breath came in slow, measured plumes that froze and vanished almost as quickly. Her legs churned, steady and relentless, her poles biting into the drifts. She could see the leaders now. They were only 100 meters ahead, their silhouettes staggering through the snow. The ranger captain's stride had shortened into something desperate. His partner stumbled every few steps, catching himself on his poles. They were no longer racing each other. They were just trying to survive long enough to reach the finish line. Anna didn't speed up. She didn't need to. Each step she took was as inevitable as gravity. In the control tower, every eye was on the drone feed. The screen showed her drawing closer to the 2 men, the storm whipping around her like a living thing. "She's still gaining," Mendoza said softly. "She hasn't changed pace once," Rostova murmured, almost to herself. "God, I forgot how cold she could be under pressure." Thorne didn't answer. His jaw was tight, his hands clasped behind his back as he stood watching. Below them in the mess hall, word had spread. Soldiers crowded around the monitors, breath fogging the glass, whispering about the woman they had mocked a week ago. Some shook their heads, stunned. Others watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. The storm lashed harder. A gust hit so strong that even Anna had to brace, driving one pole into the snow and lowering her body against the wind until it passed. Then she stood, shook the ice from her hood, and kept moving. Every step was a choice. Every step was defiance. She passed the point where Hayes had been rescued. His beacon still blinked red in the snow, marking the spot where the medevac team had pulled him off the ridge. The memory of his terrified face was still sharp in her mind, the way his voice had cracked, the way his hands had trembled. She didn't dwell on it. She didn't let herself feel the weight of the time she had lost. She just kept coming. By the time she crested the next rise, she was within 50 meters of the leaders. The storm was so heavy now that visibility was almost gone, but she could hear them, their boots crunching, their labored breathing ragged in the frozen air. They glanced back. Their faces were ghostly, pale and hollow-eyed, but the fear in them was unmistakable. Not fear of the storm. Fear of her. Anna didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She fixed her gaze on the invisible line ahead, the one that marked the path to the finish, and kept moving. In the control tower, Mendoza exhaled slowly. She's closing, she's going to pass them. The room was silent, the storm outside hammering the glass like fists. Thorne said nothing. But something had changed in his face, the hard set of his jaw softening, the cold calculation replaced by something heavier. Respect. At the next checkpoint, the medics stood ready with hot water, heat packs, and oxygen canisters. They expected racers to stumble in barely conscious, to collapse from exhaustion. Anna didn't stop. She jogged through the checkpoint without even looking at them, refilling her water from a canteen and moving on. The medic on duty stared after her, open-mouthed. She didn't even, he began. Keep watching, Mendoza said from the tower. She knows her body, Rostova said quietly, better than anyone here. The final leg of the race loomed ahead, the last, cruel joke the mountain played on those who thought they were close to victory. A wide snowfield, open and unprotected, stretched toward the finish line. The wind scoured it clean, leaving thigh-deep drifts in some places, bare ice in others. It was here that most racers broke within sight of the end with nothing left in the tank. The two leaders stumbled into the snowfield, their bodies swaying like drunks. Every step looked like it might be their last. Anna followed, her pace unchanged. The snow clutched at her legs, but she drove through it, her poles stabbing rhythmically into the ice. Her breathing stayed steady. Step, pole, step, pole. The finish line was still a faint smudge on the horizon, but she could feel it. She passed the first leader without a glance. He tried to push harder, but his body betrayed him. His stride faltered, then broke completely, leaving him staggering as she moved past. She drew level with the second man, their shoulders nearly touching. For a brief moment he looked at her, and in his eyes there was no challenge left, no anger. Only surrender. Anna kept going. Behind her, the ranger captain dropped to his knees, his body refusing to carry him any farther. In the control tower, no one spoke. They just watched. One of the techs swallowed audibly. "Sir," he said, "the whole base is watching this feed." Thorne nodded once. "Let them watch." The camera drone pulled back, catching Anna's dark figure moving alone across the snowfield, the storm swirling around her like a cloak. She didn't raise her head. She didn't look back. Every step was a statement. Every step was an answer to the laugh that had started this whole thing. The base fell silent as the image played out across the screens. Soldiers in the mess hall, mechanics in the motor pool, medics in the infirmary. Even those off-duty crowded in to see it. Somewhere deep in the storm, Anna Sharma kept climbing. And the mountain, for all its cruelty, seemed to bow its head. How far can the human spirit go before it breaks? The final kilometer waited like a dare. Anna could see the finish now, a thin red strip of fabric stretched between two poles, whipping violently in the wind. It looked impossibly far away, a banner of civilization on the edge of a wild and merciless world. The snowfield leading to it was the cruelest part of the course. Wide, open, and exposed, the wind here struck without mercy, cutting through clothing, through flesh, through will. Each step sank to mid-thigh. The snow clutched at her legs, trying to hold her in place, to drag her down into the frozen ground. But she didn't stop. Her poles drove into the snow like pistons, her breath rising in slow clouds. Her face was half buried in her hood, ice caked along her jaw, but her eyes were fixed on that strip of red. Every part of her body burned. Her quads screamed with each step. Her lungs felt like they had been lined with broken glass. Her hands had gone numb long ago, but still she gripped the poles and drove forward. There was no one ahead of her now. The two leaders were behind, broken figures struggling just to remain upright. They didn't try to catch her. They couldn't. Anna didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her world had narrowed to a single thought: forward. In the control tower, the silence was absolute. The storm battered the glass. The heaters hummed. No one moved. Mendoza stood with his hands braced against the console, leaning toward the screen as though his own will might carry her those last few meters. "She's going to do it," he breathed. Rostova said nothing. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes never left the image of Anna on the screen. Colonel Thorne's jaw was set, but not with anger anymore. Something else had taken its place, something older, deeper. Respect. And maybe something uncomfortably close to regret. "Sound the horn," he said finally. A deep blast rolled out over the base, signaling the final stretch. The sound echoed off the surrounding peaks, carried down into the valley. Soldiers came spilling out of the barracks, the mess hall, the motor pool. They gathered along the makeshift fence near the finish line, bracing themselves against the wind, their eyes locked on the lone figure emerging from the whiteout. At first she was just a shape. Then the shape became a woman moving with a kind of terrible grace, her stride mechanical, unstoppable. The storm seemed to go quiet for a moment, as if holding its breath. Anna drove her poles forward one last time, crossed the invisible line and stopped. There was no cheer, no roar of celebration, only silence. She planted her poles in the snow, placed her hands on her knees, and took 3 deep, controlled breaths. Steam rose from her body like smoke. Then she straightened. Her back was straight, her shoulders squared, her face streaked with ice and exhaustion, but her eyes were clear. The entire base stood watching her. No one moved. No one spoke. The storm lashed around them, but it was distant now, muted compared to the weight of the moment. From the control tower, a single figure emerged. Colonel Thorne walked through the deep snow, his cap pulled low against the wind, his coat whipping around his legs. Each step felt deliberate, heavy. He stopped directly in front of her. The man who had laughed at her on the parade ground. The man who had dismissed her as a mistake, a paper pusher. He looked at her now, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw no mockery in his eyes. Only acknowledgement. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He raised his right hand in a slow, deliberate salute, not the perfunctory gesture owed to a senior NCO, but a perfect, sharp salute, full of something that almost hurt to name. Respect. Recognition. Apology. Behind him, Lieutenant Mendoza snapped his own hand up in salute, then another soldier, then another. Within seconds, the entire gathered formation was standing at attention, their hands raised in a wave of silent respect. The sound of the storm filled the space between them, but no words were spoken. Anna stood perfectly still, letting it wash over her. She had not asked for this. She had not come here for them. But she had earned it. The colonel dropped his hand at last, turned, and walked back toward the tower without another word. Anna remained where she was for a long moment, her breath finally beginning to slow, her pulse still hammering in her ears. Then slowly, she pulled her poles from the snow, turned and walked back toward the barracks. She did not look back at the finish line. The race was over. But the mountain had left its mark. What does a mountain look like after it has been conquered? By nightfall, the storm was gone. The clouds had been torn apart, leaving behind a world washed clean and draped in white. Snow glittered under a brittle, star-filled sky. The peaks around the base stood like silent sentinels, their jagged edges glowing faintly in the moonlight. The race was over, but the base was not quiet. The infirmary buzzed with low, urgent voices. Medics moved from cot to cot, tending to racers suffering from exhaustion, frostbite, and hypothermia. The smell of antiseptic and wet wool hung in the air. Lieutenant Hayes lay propped up on a cot near the corner, his legs splinted and wrapped. He was pale but awake, a thin line of pain etched between his brows. A medic adjusted his IV, then moved on. When the door opened and Corporal Carter stepped in, Hayes turned his head. "She's back," Hayes asked immediately. Carter nodded. "She crossed first, past you, past everyone." Hayes let out a shaky breath, half a laugh. "Of course she did." Word had spread faster than the storm had passed. Soldiers in the infirmary whispered about her as though speaking too loudly might summon her. The name they had once mocked now carried weight. Some called her the Wraith of Kalen Ridge. Others just called her ma'am. In the mess hall, the atmosphere had shifted too. The usual rough laughter was gone, replaced by low voices, by glances at the monitors still showing the replay of the finish. The storm's footage ran on a loop, Anna's dark figure crossing the snowfield again and again like a ghost refusing to fade. Nobody laughed this time. Back in the barracks, Anna sat alone on the edge of her bunk. Her gear was laid out in precise order, just as it had been before the race. She had already cleaned it, drying each strap, brushing the ice from every seam. Now she worked a small tin of wax into the fabric, re-waterproofing the pack she trusted more than she trusted most people. It was ritual. Not for victory, not for pride. For order. Her hands moved automatically, even as her body ached. The race had drained her. Her legs throbbed with dull fire, her shoulders screamed from the constant drive of the poles, her lungs felt scraped raw from the frozen air. But her face was calm. She had felt worse. She had looked worse. She had been worse. When the door opened, Carter stepped in quietly as though entering a church. He held a steaming ceramic mug in both hands, careful not to spill it. He hesitated near her bunk. "They're all talking about you," he said finally, his voice soft. Anna didn't look up from the strap she was waxing. Carter cleared his throat, his ears red from the cold. "They're calling you the Wraith of Kalen Ridge." Anna paused just for a second. Then she set the tin down, looked at the steam rising from the mug, and then at him. A flicker of something touched her eyes. Not a smile exactly, but a softening, as though something deep inside her had just unclenched. "Thank you, Corporal," she said quietly. He nodded, placed the mug on the small metal nightstand, and stepped back toward the door. He hesitated once, as though he wanted to say more, but whatever words he had stayed unspoken. He left her in silence. Anna sat for a long moment, staring at the rising steam. Then she stood, wrapped her hands around the warm mug, and walked to the narrow window. Outside, the world was still. The summit of Kalen Ridge was painted in fire, the last light of sunset turning the snow into molten gold before fading into deep purple shadow. She sipped the coffee slowly, the heat bleeding into her cold fingers. She had won. But she felt no triumph, no rush of victory. The race had never been about them. It had never been about the colonel, or the snickers on the parade ground, or the humiliation. It had been about something quieter, something older. A private promise she had made to herself long before this mountain, that she would not let the world decide who she was. Behind her, the barracks was quiet. Most of its occupants were still in the infirmary or sleeping off their ordeal. The air smelled faintly of wet boots and snow. She stood there until the last light died from the peak. Then she set the mug down, blew out a slow breath, and sat back on her bunk. Tomorrow, the mountain would still be there. And so would she. What do you do the day after you've silenced an entire mountain? Morning broke sharp and clear, the sky a brilliant, impossible blue. The storm had scoured everything, leaving the base looking new as though the night before had been a baptism. The parade ground was still half buried in snow, boots crunching through the hard crust as soldiers moved between buildings. Conversations were quieter today. The usual swagger had softened into something closer to reverence. Anna stepped out of the barracks, her boots freshly polished, her pack cleaned and stowed. There was no victory lap, no display. She moved with the same quiet precision as always, but heads turned as she passed. Not mocking glances this time. Respectful ones. Some soldiers nodded to her. Others simply stepped aside, letting her walk past without a word. The atmosphere had changed, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the small, almost invisible ways that mattered most. In the mess hall, the conversations died as she entered. No one meant to fall silent, it just happened. Anna collected her tray, sat at her usual table in the corner, and ate with the same calm method she always had. Slowly, quietly. But this time she wasn't alone. Corporal Carter brought his tray over and sat opposite her without asking. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You didn't have to save Hayes," Carter said finally, his voice quiet. Anna didn't look up. She chewed, swallowed, then set her fork down. "Yes, I did." It was simple, matter of fact. Carter nodded slowly, understanding that this was not bravado. It wasn't even morality, not in the way most people thought of it. It was duty. The kind that lived deep in the bones, past orders, past pride. Across the base, Colonel Thorne stood in his office, staring at the frozen peaks outside his window. He hadn't spoken much since the finish. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he was still deciding what to say. On his desk lay Anna's file, the thin, unimpressive folder that had once defined her to him. He turned it over, the paper creasing under his fingers. Wraith, Rostova had called her. He'd heard the name before, in classified debriefs, in stories told in low voices by operators who had seen too much. It was the kind of name that made even seasoned men straighten in their seats. And now she was on his base, standing in his formation, running his race. He thought about the way she had moved through the storm, the way she had stopped for Hayes without hesitation, the way she had crossed the finish line without asking for anything. Not praise, not glory, not even acknowledgement. There was something in that kind of quiet that unsettled him. Later that afternoon, Anna found herself in the gear room, rechecking the seals on her boots. The simple work kept her hands busy, kept her thoughts quiet. But thoughts had a way of creeping in anyway. The scrape of leather under her fingers triggered a memory she hadn't touched in years. A night on another mountain, thousands of miles away. Snow then too. But darker. Quieter. She remembered the weight of her rifle against her shoulder, the steady breath she'd taken before the shot, the target in her scope, a man whose face she never saw clearly. She remembered the radio crackle, the order in her ear. The shot had been perfect. The mission a success. And yet when she'd lowered the rifle, when the silence had closed in around her again, she'd felt nothing. No pride. No relief. Just the cold. She blinked, coming back to the present, to the sound of the wind rattling the windows. That life was behind her. This was supposed to be different. But maybe it never really was. The door to the gear room opened, pulling her out of the memory. It was Colonel Thorne. He stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. His face was as unreadable as hers. "Master Sergeant," he said finally. She straightened, standing at ease. He studied her for a long moment. "You made this base take a hard look at itself yesterday," he said at last. His voice was calm, but there was a gravity in it that hadn't been there before. "You made me take a hard look." Anna didn't reply. Thorne stepped closer, his boots crunching on the grit-covered floor. "I misjudged you," he said simply. It was not an apology, not exactly, but it was close enough. Anna gave a single nod. She didn't need more. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thorne inclined his head slightly. "Carry on, Sergeant." He turned and left. Anna stood alone in the quiet gear room, staring at the door long after it closed. She wasn't sure what she felt. Vindication. Relief. Maybe neither. Maybe both. She picked up her boots again and went back to work. Outside, the sun dipped lower, staining the snow with streaks of red and gold. Tomorrow, drills would resume. The base would go back to its routine. The next intake of recruits would arrive. And the mountain would wait, as it always had, for the next one brave or foolish enough to challenge it. Anna finished her work, set the boots neatly aside, and sat in silence for a long time. She had been called Wraith once, whispered about as if she were a ghost. Now on Kalen Ridge, they were whispering again. And this time she wasn't sure which haunted her more, the name they used to know, or the one they had just given her. What do you do when there are no more mountains to climb? Night had fallen again, bringing with it a deep and fragile silence. The wind had died, leaving the base wrapped in a stillness that was almost reverent. The stars burned cold above the peaks, each one sharp enough to pierce the dark. Anna sat alone on her bunk. The barracks was quiet tonight. No laughter, no boasting, no restless shifting of men who couldn't sleep. Just the slow, even breathing of exhausted soldiers, the occasional creak of the building settling in the cold. Her gear was spread neatly across her blanket, not because it needed to be, because she needed it to be. Each strap wiped down, each buckle polished, each seam checked twice. The pack was more than equipment. It was a constant, a truth she could hold onto in a world that shifted too often, too fast. When she finished, she set it aside and sat with her hands resting on her knees, listening to the quiet. She thought of Hayes. The last she'd seen of him, he had been propped up in the infirmary, his leg in a cast, his face pale but grateful. He had tried to thank her, but she had only nodded and walked out. Words were easy. Actions were not. The rescue had cost her minutes, cost her position, at least in theory. But she had not hesitated, not even for the space of a breath. That was the part she kept turning over in her mind. Not that she had done it, but that there had never been a choice. It was who she was. And maybe that was why she was here, on this frozen mountain, with a file that didn't say half of what it should have. Maybe this was her penance. A knock sounded at the door. It was soft, hesitant, not the bark of an officer, not the careless slam of a soldier who didn't care about protocol. Carter stepped inside. He had a notebook in his hand this time, not a mug. "Evening, Sergeant," he said quietly. Anna nodded once. He stood there for a moment, as if weighing whether he should speak. Then he opened the notebook, glancing down at the page. "They posted the race results," he said finally. "They put your time on the board, fastest in 5 years." Anna didn't answer. Carter hesitated, then looked up at her. They put your name on the wall." She frowned slightly. "What wall?" "The one in the control tower," he said, "where they list the names of everyone who's completed the Serpent's Ascent. You're the first woman on it." For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind against the windows. Then Anna nodded once. "Good," she said softly. Carter closed the notebook. "Ma'am," he said, straightening slightly. It wasn't required. She wasn't his officer, but he did it anyway. Then he left her to her silence. Anna sat for a long time, staring at the space where he had stood. She didn't feel pride, not exactly. What she felt was harder to name. Not triumph, not even relief. Something colder. Something quieter. She stood, crossed the room, and picked up the still warm mug of coffee from her nightstand, Carter's offering from the night before. It was cold now, but she lifted it anyway, holding it between her palms. Then she walked to the narrow window and looked out. The peaks were bathed in moonlight, their jagged edges softened by the fresh snow. The path of the race was invisible now, buried under the white, as if it had never existed at all. But she remembered every step. The sound of boots crunching in the snow. The rasp of her breath in her throat. The weight of Hayes's body when she'd held him upright. The silence at the finish line. And Thorne's salute. She had not come here to win their respect. But she had it now. Earned not with words, not with arguments, not with demands. But with endurance. With action. She watched until her breath fogged the glass. The moon rose higher, casting long shadows across the valley. Somewhere beyond the peaks, another storm was forming, waiting for the next soul to challenge the ridge. Anna turned from the window, set the mug down, and extinguished the single lamp that lit the room. The darkness closed in around her, but she felt no fear in it. She lay down on her bunk, hands folded over her chest, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring drills, orders, noise. But tonight there was only this. The silence. The mountain. And the quiet dignity of knowing she had met the storm, and it had not broken her. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And when it does, the world cannot help but fall silent.